Well, now we're going to look at one of the most important issues that has come about due to the pandemic, which is schools. And are schools safe? Can they be open? And if so, if they are not safe, what can be done to make them safe? Now, this is fundamentally a problem that architects can solve, or can at least address. They may not be able to solve it completely. And I'm very pleased to welcome Chris Bryant, who's director of the Architects' Almanac, to talk about a piece of work that he and his firm have been working on called Simple Solutions for Safer Schools. And he's going to outline that and what methods and what approaches can be taken. And we also will have some comments from Melanie Mortimer, who is the head of design technology at one of the schools which participated in the study that Chris has put together called Dulwich Prep in South London. So, Chris, do you want to take this away?
Thanks very much. Sometimes necessity really is the mother of invention. What if in the long term, this pandemic became known as a critical instigator of change in the way we design schools for the better? And what if the way that we have dealt with the problem is the shining example of our adaptability, resourceful, and ingenuity? My name's Chris, and I'm a director at alma-nac and also a visiting lecturer at the University of Westminster. And it's great here to have the opportunity to present to a worldwide audience, especially as our work is so local to us. 95% of all our projects are within 45-minute cycle of the office, and this one is no different. Today I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing in a number of schools in London that brought together ideas of dealing with COVID restrictions, and then some of the lessons that we've learned that might influence design of the future. I'm very glad that Melanie's been able to join us, the design technology teacher from Dulwich Prep London. It's a school, and Melanie herself, someone we've had a relationship for a long time, and it's great to be able to get her views on this as well. I'm going to quickly outline how we came to this project and what lessons we may have learned from it, and then the three of us will be able to have a discussion. At alma-nac, we're huge advocates of participatory design, and we strongly believe that through proper participation, you can harness expertise and create collective ownership of projects. If you go to our website, you'll see a page dedicated to the work that we do in this area. And we're always interested to hear from others and people's own experiences across the world. Like many of our projects, Safer Schools Manual origin is serendipitous. For a year before the pandemic, we'd been working on this project, the Dulwich Picture Gallery Planters Project. The Colour Palace, a temporary pavilion designed by Price Gore Architects and Yinka Ilori, at the Dulwich Picture Gallery, was due to be taken down. And we'd received a call from one of the team that helped to manufacture this to see if we knew anyone who could do anything interesting with the material that was both in keeping with the original premise of sustainability and reuse. At the same time, and totally unconnected, we were working with Melanie and her students at Dulwich Prep on ideas of how to add greenery to their school. They wanted to create modular planters. And all of a sudden, we had all of this material. Here they are, creating some of those modular planters in the classroom with two of the members of alma-nac there. And this is one of the early prototypes. Now, all the material that we had didn't just allow for planters at Dulwich Prep London, it actually allowed for 200 planters. And so with the help of Dulwich Picture Gallery, we contacted all the local schools and see if they too wanted to create planters with their pupils and add greenery to their school grounds. So we came up with a manual that could be easily followed, and that different schools, depending on the age groups, could either have the wood pre-cut or they could cut it themselves. And the idea, right on our doorstep in South London, would be that this colour pavilion that would be at Dulwich Picture Gallery would be distributed across the local area and literally green the other schools. So just as this was happening, I think my slides might be not going through. Great, thank you. So just as this happening, the COVID struck. And so the workshop that we had planned when all the schools were going to come together and that we were going to distribute this material for all of these planters was paused. And the scheme had to be put on hold. But we developed really strong relationships with the school, and it became apparent that the pandemic would continue for a long time, and schools were going to have to cope with incredibly challenging circumstances. We thought that there might be a way of utilising this network and providing some help. We contacted all the schools in late spring and talked to them about our idea. We wanted to understand what schools were doing to allow pupils for key workers onto the site and how they would bring more pupils back in September in a safe environment. We thought we might be able to add to these ideas, but most importantly, create a document that shared these ideas in a positive and easy to read way. This could then be distributed more widely. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thanks. Unsurprisingly, all the schools were in a firefighting mode and incredibly busy, but 8 agreed to be part of this, and so we interviewed them and managed to even visit some. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As you can see, the schools were very different. There was different age ranges, both primary and secondary. Some were state, some were private. They were in different scales, different types of grounds, all with different challenges. Next slide, please. We found that staff had come up with ways of reorganising space, keeping equipment safe, changing circulation, and utilising outdoor space. We took these ideas and developed them into a manual. Next slide, please. The restrictions for COVID from the government were fluid and they were changing. So we made sure that we were on top of these, and we kept our document up to date with these, but trying to give it back to the schools in an easy to read way that could easily be digested and easily communicated with both parents and staff. There were a number of challenges. Parents were no longer allowed into the school, and therefore those crucial moments of contact were lost. So the school gate had to become the notice board, the place for sharing, the place for meeting, the place for talking. It became the gateway literally into the school, both physically but also in terms of information. Next slide, please. To teach younger children about social distancing, one school came up with the idea of social wings that would get across the message of this 2-metre rule that suddenly everybody was having to adhere to. Next slide, please. To enable effective bubbling and social distancing, schools needed to utilise any additional space they had. Outdoor space became very important, and we shared some ideas on how these spaces could be adapted. Next slide, please. To avoid the spread of COVID-19, it was important to keep personal belongings separated and avoid sharing equipment as much as possible. We looked at the importance of creating a familiar and personalised experience for the students, and simple things like creating their own storage boxes, labelling their own equipment, and creating their own classroom charters could help with that. Next slide, please. We also looked at spatial solutions and how desks could be arranged within the classroom. Next slide, please. We completed the manual in the summer and sent it out to all the schools, and we're beginning to collect feedback from those schools and pupils. Here is some feedback from the head teacher at Hollydale. Next slide, please. And here is some of the feedback that we've recently been getting from the pupils. So the schools have been able to use this in their different ways. Some have used it as a communication tool, some have used it as a tool for staff or pupils or parents. Some of you have implemented many of the suggestions. And so this network has, in a sense, bonded together and given each other ideas. Next slide, please. It's also freely available to anybody who wants to download it. And anyone who would like to look at it, please go to the website, www.alma-nac.com, and request the download. We've had interest from across the world: Indonesia, America, Taiwan, India, New Zealand, and we very much would be interested to share this and hear what anyone else had to think about it. Next slide, please. Part 2 of the manual looked at the future of what we could possibly learn. We're right in the midst of this. We're in the second lockdown, even more difficult now for schools than ever before. And schools are still, rightly, trying to get through with what they're dealing with. But as we have these conversations, we can see that the people are reflecting, and we're reflecting too, on what are the positives that have come out of this. What can we learn from this very challenging time that might help us move forward and make school design even better? Next slide, please. So this is the Hollydale School that we just had the feedback from, and we did a quick design exercise to look at how could you add to it, how could you adapt it, how could it become even better? Because we've learned some key things. We've learned the importance of well-being for both staff and students, and the need to engage actively with that. We've learned about the adaptability of students and teachers, the importance of those incidental conversations and the non-classroom moments. We've learned about the inventiveness and ingenuity of pupils and staff. We've learned how positive outdoor learning can be and the huge benefits of that, about reconnecting with your surroundings. We've learned how crucial the school is as a linchpin of the community, and how the school gate and the meetings that go on there are a linchpin of that. Schools bring people together. They are a place of great creativity, great care and mixing. We've learned that different students excel in different types of environments. We've heard about students that have become even more confident when interacting via video. We've also learned, though, that video can work, but it's never going to replace face-to-face. All of this suggests that our schools can become even more heterogeneous, flexible, and adaptable to different types of learning and interaction. Next slide, please. And crucial to this, we believe, is getting as many people involved as early on in the design process. Pupils, staff at the school, teachers, head teachers, parents, all have expertise in parts of school life. We think it's hugely important that the design process, which can lead to these more flexible, more adaptable, greater ownership of these schools, is put in place. Next slide, please. That image that you just saw is from one of a number of workshops that we've been doing in South London for a new school for pupils from age 6 to 12. And this is one of the images that's come from it, and it's now in planning. We've held workshops with younger children, older children, different staff, both technical staff and teaching staff. Next slide, please. Following all of this and discussions with the pupils, is going to be a net carbon zero building. It's going to possibly have the first, maybe not the first, but one of the first well-being buildings dedicated to well-being right in the middle of the school, for the whole school. Next slide, please. And it's also going to have a specific classroom dedicated to outdoor learning. This has come about through lots of quality conversations and activities with the pupils, with the teachers, with the other staff, to ask them really what they want, what do they think we can do, and then we feed back to them, and then The brief develops and there's a collective ownership over that brief. Next slide, please. We're convinced that even though we're coming through one of the most challenging times education has ever had, that out of this, we can really see positive changes in the way that we design schools. And that from this, we can see how school design can be even greater, even more flexible, even more adaptable, even more central to the community. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for a fascinating presentation of how schools can be retrofitted as well as conceived to be not just safe for COVID, but as improved educational resources. And as I understand it, you and Melanie have been working together for some time, long before anyone had even heard of COVID. And I wonder, Melanie, if you could outline how you first started working with Chris and what that relationship has brought to the education that you can offer to your students.
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. Well, actually, what Chris was saying about serendipity actually did happen with us as well, because they were architects in residence at the school down the road, and we were invited to their private view, me and the head of art, and we were just having a conversation about participatory design, and it just so happened that every day as I walked through the school gates, I walked across a playground that was quite it was a little bit grim and needed some enlivening, so I thought it'd be a great project for our year sevens to tackle. And the next morning, actually, Adam Shapland from alma-nac phoned up and said they'd be very interested in collaborating with us on that speculative project. So it gave the boys a huge opportunity to work with industry professionals because they work so differently to teachers. And it was a real collaboration because the boys would come up with designs and then the architects would go away and give them relevant research ideas to look at. And then the boys would make sketch models and alma-nac would put it into their CAD machine and create a scale drawing that we could then make an accurate model from. So it was such a rich experience for both, I think. You know, we'll ask Chris in a minute what his experience was of the collaboration. But I think our boys got a huge amount of pride and involvement and feeling that they could do so many different skills, guided by somebody that was outside their, you know, normal environment. And that was it was great to finish with the scale model, but it felt like we could actually get them to have even more agency once that project was finished.
And for as long as I've been, certainly when I started studying architecture, which is quite a long time ago now, there was a very big sense that architecture should somehow work its way into the national curriculum for schools in Britain, which was being developed in the mid and late 1980s. And what I think, Chris, you're doing is actually achieving that you are sharing not just how architecture can be, as it were, a sort of servant to the operation of a school at the level of providing spaces and buildings and whatever, but also can be part of a way of infusing the students with ideas about architecture and indeed getting them to think about architecture. Have you, in the work that you've done, Chris, come across any budding architects among the pupils you're working with, who on the whole are quite young?
It's a good question. We've definitely what we do find is that because we've done things at a number of schools, we find people are really interested in design. We find that 12-year-olds, for example, can read a plan better than most adults I know. They understand space. I think what they like often is that it's cross disciplines. And we older students, we've definitely found budding architects because we have them in for work experience. And I think the younger students, you know, they've taken to it with great vigor. You know, for a lot of them, they see it as playing with, you know, with space and materials, and for them, and that's hugely enjoyable for them.
Yes, and I suppose one of the things that comes out here is the fostering for the pupils or the students of a different way of working. And again, Melanie, you touched on it, but could you expand a little bit on what it is that professionals like architects do differently to teachers, and what do the pupils get from that experience?
Yes, to start with, one example of that was actually when we were starting to talk about the planter project. It was Tristan and Adam that said, let's make them really site specific. So what might you need in this space, and what might you put there? And that was really fascinating for the boys. It was an angle that I actually, despite architectural training myself, hadn't thought would be a really relevant starting point, because the boys were real experts at the playground space, and they knew from years of using it where boys went to be quiet, where it was really, really busy. They even knew where the rainfall and where the drips were. And they also got really excited about talking to the cookery teacher about what kind of herbs she'd like at what time of year. So it's solving real practical problems and actually making a difference. That they felt enormous pride in once the planters were finished and then on site, that the school could benefit from that, and they could get feedback from the people using it and the visitors, etc. And there was one boy, for example, that said, I want to take charge of choosing the plants because I'm really interested in botany. And then his friend said, well, you choose them, and I'd really like to phone up the garden centres and see if we can get a discount. So it's those kind of experiences which I think will really prepare them. It's the soft skills, but it's merging the practical skills with real life examples as well, and being able to use their imagination in an extraordinary way, but make collective decisions, which is pretty tough, I think.
And all of this, as you say, is very useful for life skills, because on the whole, these boys are quite young, aren't they? 11, 12, that sort of age?
That's right.
So what you're doing is reaching beyond the confines of a normal educational curriculum, and actually giving them something which can both enthuse them. So the boy who had an interest in botany could indulge that in a way that perhaps working through the normal curriculum might have been able to grow something in a biology class, but would not on the whole have been able to develop a specific interest in the practicalities of growing plants, nor would necessarily the boy who wanted to go to the local nursery and negotiate the price been able to develop commercial skills. So all of this, I think, is showing how one can use the modifications to the built environment as a way of enriching not just the purely educational, but the whole experience of being at school.
Yes, and the next group that are working now on the planters have adapted them to the COVID situation in the playground, because now we have to have bubble separations. So we're thinking, rather than just being plants to enjoy, they could actually be sort of reminders in the playground that it's not just about being separate, but it also could be something quite joyful. And this group have actually taken it a step further and are taking control of the whole design process. So they're deciding what should go on the ground and how we could add the bunting, etc., based on some of the safer school tips in the booklet.
So it's much more than just putting strips of tape on the ground and saying you have to stand on this side of the line, you can't cross it. it's actually making that line into something much more enjoyable and possibly even educational as well, I guess.
Mm. And we did have a conversation actually just last week with one of the Year 3 teachers who said, I'd be delighted if you would focus on that playground because the boys don't have anything to play with at the moment and they're getting a bit bored. So she was saying, can you now use the planters for marble runs and sand pits and and garages for and places to hide. So that's, it's opening up all sorts of options for them.
Yes, I think this is extremely interesting because it's about making the whole environment of the school really work. Because one of the things that strikes me about schools in general is that they're either over-resourced in the sense that if you give them a swimming pool, extensive playing fields, a gymnasium, that's great for the school. It's great for the students who are there. But they're only used generally 5 days a week and maybe only for 40 or so weeks in the year. So there's a lot of time when those quite expensive pieces of equipment or facilities are idle. And what you're doing is looking at how even the most simple things like a planter or a piece of furniture that you put into the playground can do more than one, two, or even three things. It can actually be an overall enhancement to the entire experience. I think that's a fascinating point.
And
Perhaps,
the boys
Chris,
themselves,
you could say a bit more about how that works in design terms and how you come to conceive it and deliver it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and it's great when we hear about things that we've seeded becoming all of these other things and taking on a life of their own. And I think that is the power of what we do as designers. If we can do something small that has a great effect, I think we're achieving a lot. I think it's interesting when you talk about the resource in schools, and that this pandemic has made us aware of the importance of schools in the community. For a lot of people, their trip to the school is the only trip they're probably having outdoors at the moment. They might be going to the shop as well, but it's one of the, it might be the only chance they get to see people. The project that I was talking about in South London, where we're creating this wellbeing pavilion, crucial to that wellbeing pavilion is that it can be used until 11 at night, 52 weeks of the year, 7 days a week. We've arranged it so that the way, down to how the entrances work and how the security works, that can be used so that this doesn't just become a wellbeing pavilion for the school, which is, in a sense, having a wellbeing pavilion for a school is very generous. Almost, you could say almost overly generous in a sense, but because it then becomes also for the community and other schools to come and use, then that resource is being used to its full extent. I think a lot of what the work we do, we're always interested in how you can, whatever you can do, how can you maximise its gain with a minimum resource.
Yes, and I think this is something that reaches beyond COVID because one hopes, and it now seems reasonably likely, that within the course of the next year, vaccines will cause COVID to retreat as a threat to our ways of life and our normal going about our daily business. But one of the things that you're raising here is how, by these quite modest adjustments to how schools work and the sort of equipment they might have in them, they can become real community hubs. And you may develop the idea of the gate as the notice board or as the place of social interaction. And obviously, we all know that school playgrounds become congregating places for parents when they come to pick up their kids in the afternoon or to drop them off in the morning. And there's a lot of social interaction that goes on around that. Now, if there are ways that you can somehow facilitate that social interaction and give it some sort of focus and possibly offer opportunities to benefit from it, just as you're offering opportunities for the educational process to be improved, I think that becomes an extremely interesting thing. And of course, then becomes perhaps an argument and maybe a justification for spending greater resources on schools, which I think in general have been quite starved of resources in the last few years.
Yes, and I think that's like you say, I think that's a positive that will come out of this is understanding the importance of spending money in schools and resource. And I think you're completely right. But one way of doing that is saying this isn't just for pupils. This is a resource for everybody, and everybody's got, you know, we all need education to work. That's we're reliant on the next generation. So it helps all of us if we have positive environments for both learning for the community. And I think that will, and I think also, this idea of well-being and these different types of spaces for learning. Again, it will give more facilities to the community. So rather than just saying, "Oh, school hall and 8 classrooms," all of a sudden we might have a school hall, an outside classroom, a garden hut, a cookery pavilion. They don't have to be expensive, flashy things. They just have to be well organised, well arranged, and inviting with the infrastructure behind it to allow that to happen.
Yes, and I well remember from my school days, quite a long time ago now, that if the weather was good and we could go outside, it added enormously to the experience of education. And one has to say that most teachers, particularly the really good ones, could adapt the way they taught to being outside in a way that made being outside really enjoyable and pleasurable. Now, I think if one can extend that into saying, well, it's not just the lesson, it's the way you interact with your friends through the playground, the way you might interact with your parents and your friends' parents and your parents' friends who all congregate there. It makes school, I think, what it should be, and in many cases aspires to be, which is a real community hub. But I think, I wonder, Melanie, if you could say something about how the outdoor lessons can be used to enhance the learning experience.
Yes, it's interesting to think about that because, during the summer we were in deep lockdown, and so we were doing all our lessons remotely. And I think in some senses that could actually be an element of what we're talking about now, because we had children who were actually accessing learning from all over the country, and if you're on a portable device, for example, you have the opportunity to relate to your teacher directly. You can kind of create small group learning. So, I mean, it'd be really, this is thinking on the hop now, but it'd be really fascinating if you could, as a teacher, set them off on almost a scavenger hunt, and keep a check on them, because you could, because you can keep in very close contact on an iPad device, and see what they're finding out, that they can take photographs and you can respond immediately to that. I mean, we have done lovely lessons outside when we've looked really carefully and done observational drawings, for example, just lying on the tummy and looking at things in different scales. And we've used it to play games, but I think at the moment with the planter project, for example, we've sent a little team out with a set of chalks to go and mark things directly onto the ground, so they've got that one-to-one experience, and they can start to ask colleagues, friends, other pupils opinions, and come back with feedback from that. So yeah, some suggestions there.
So it's very much a sort of curated learning experience in which students themselves take some responsibility for what they do, although there's always a supervisory element from the teacher, rather than a sort of dictatorial or explicitly didactic, that this is what you need to know, your times tables or your grammar and punctuation, all those things that quite frankly, most students find a little bit tedious, although most of us do eventually absorb that. But do you think that this puts a great premium on designers, and perhaps, Chris, you could come in if Melanie wants to say a few words first, on dematerializing the boundaries between inside and outside space and making them flow much more easily together?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, if you'd like to start, then perhaps Chris can come in.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking that, you know, in some ways, the curatorial process it's very enjoyable, because the pupils, once they realise that that's the way they can operate, they have huge investment in what they're doing. But I think there has to be some underlying principles, you know, that you want things to be sustainable. You want them, because, you know, pupils are very, very interested in keeping things environmentally friendly. And you want them to, as we've been saying, to have some community benefit. So I think underneath that, let's do this collaboratively, I think you need some kind of structures that you work within, and maybe values. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Jeremy, that that it has opened our eyes to that possibility. And yeah, I think, you know, equipment that can be moved from inside to outside, that change of environment can also, you know, heard from teachers, keep students awake, so they're not in, you know, one of the things that's happened is that students, I think in all age groups, have been in the same classroom, or teachers have been moving, you know, and the fact that they're in that same classroom is sort of, you know, after lunch become very tired. I think we can, you know, look at how schools can have semi-indoor, outdoor spaces, fully outdoor spaces, indoor spaces. We've got a relatively mild climate here. There was a nursery by Will Alsop Architects where it was mostly outside, and they just gave all of the children gilets. You know, and you know, kids like being outside. So I do think it's dematerializing that separation.
Yes, and I guess we all know that in order to get funding, particularly for state schools, government-funded schools, you need to show evidence in order to unlock extra funding. And I wonder, Melanie, if there's any way in which you can measure improvements in students' performance, or in other ways in which the school can operate more smoothly by adopting these sorts of approaches.
Yes, it's very interesting. We've been using a particular way of assessing our own progress, and it's based on this. I'm going to just lean across. Hang on. There we go. I've got the sheet. It's called the Centre for Real World Learning's 5-Dimensional Model of Creativity. And what's so interesting about this is that what it's judging the pupils on is things like using intuition, challenging assumptions, tolerating uncertainty. And what's been very fascinating about the last couple of years, I suppose, when we've been collaborating closely with Alma-nac, is how the pupils have used these skills and been able to articulate how they have. Because I think if you can prove that they understand the 21st century skills that they will need in future life, I think it's saying that, you know, for example, design and technology and architecture can be incredibly valuable for them.
Well, thank you. And I suppose the leading question that comes out of all of this is that would you have got these sorts of approaches and ideas without the crisis imposed by the COVID pandemic? Or would you has that been a real stimulus to achieving what you're trying to achieve and look like being able to achieve because of COVID?
Shall I say a couple of words? I think I think from our point of view, it's sped it up. I do think out of crisis comes ingenuity and often change. So I think it probably, whether it's caused it or just sped it up, I'm not sure, but definitely there's a lot more conversation about those types of things.
I think this is an interesting. Sorry, Melanie.
I was just going to say that some of the things that have come out of COVID are how much we can do without, that you can have a much simpler time, and the importance of connecting. So as sort of key concepts for going forward.
So forcing us to think about the essence of what education is and how it can be best delivered. So I think it's probably fair to say that from this discussion, maybe something good will have been come out of this sort of wreckage that COVID has otherwise imposed on us, and in particular, for the purpose of this conversation, at least on schools and the education of children. And I think what I'm taking away from this, and I don't mean this entirely facetiously, is that every school has a potential to become Plato's Academy, where a group of students gather around a tree in the open air to learn both between themselves and with an instructor. So thank you very much for that. That's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much.